On November 17, 1984, third-ranked BYU beat Utah 24-14. This was a closer game than the score indicates, and BYU really looked pretty bad.
Bosco is going to run. 45 fumble. Big scramble for the football at the Utah.
Now, on the same day, number 2 South Carolina, another non-traditional power, was crushed by Navy. Meanwhile, most of the country watched as number 6 Oklahoma upset Nebraska 17-7 on national television. And that means that BYU wound up ranked number 1 in the country, putting itself in a position to win its first and only national championship. Well, 1984 is really one of my favorite college football seasons of all time. And I mean, it's not just because, I went to BYU and stuff like that. I love it because of the complete and utter chaos that happened all season long. And really, when you look at it, it is the only time in the history of college football where an outsider team, a non-traditional power, was able to get in. Well, I've been reading complaints online over the past few days about college football rankings, and it seems that nobody's happy. For instance, number 14 Vanderbilt lost to number 4 Alabama and number 10 Texas. Number 9 Notre Dame lost to number 3 Texas A&M and Miami in 2 close games. Number 10 Texas, which beat Vanderbilt, lost to number 1 Ohio State, but they also lost to a really bad Florida team. And number 11 Oklahoma lost to number 7 Ole Miss, but was also crushed by Texas. So, honestly, the logic behind this does nothing but make my brain hurt. When I sat down to write this today and figure this out, it just gives me a headache. So we're looking at whether this team that beat that team but lost to the other team is better than this other team that beat the other team but lost to that team. There's no consistency to it, and it only gets worse when you have these dark horse teams that come from out of nowhere that didn't play any of those teams that end up trying to spoil the party. BYU's success in 1984 came largely because every other competing team lost. That season was filled with bizarre results, such as number 1 Washington losing badly to USC on November 10th, which meant that USC won the Pac-10. Texas lost badly to Houston that same day, causing a downward spiral. Texas had been as high as 2nd in the nation, but wound up losing 4 of its last 5 games. BYU, meanwhile, only played 1 ranked team all season, and that was the first game of the season against Pitt, which was ranked 3rd at the time. Pitt had a horrible year afterwards and wound up with a losing record. Now, 1984 really was one of those once-in-a-blue-moon type seasons. It was the rare season where all of the major contenders wound up losing. Now, the whole concept of a major contender or a blue blood school is something that goes back to the beginning of the sport. And the thing is that reputation has always been a big thing. So, for example, the biggest game of 1884 was the Yale-Princeton game on Thanksgiving Day, which wound up being a famous and controversial tie. The few schools that played the sport in 1884 and kept up with the sport wound up with a built-in advantage. For years, the reputation of the old days ensured that Ivy League schools were always taken seriously in the national college football conversation. For example, at the end of the 1964 season, undefeated Princeton was ranked 13th in the final coaches poll, mostly because they were still undefeated. This happened despite the obvious fact that Princeton didn't play against a single major program all season. And the appeal of tradition is really strong in college football. To this day, it's really strong, and it's always been that way. So, for example, in 1946, the Georgia Bulldogs went undefeated to cap off the greatest season in the school's history. Not only did Georgia win every single game and beat 4 ranked teams, but the games weren't even close. As impressive as Georgia's record was, though, it really wasn't seen as one of the blue blood programs. Georgia's problem that season was that Army and Notre Dame had played to a famous scoreless draw at Yankee Stadium. In contrast to Georgia, Notre Dame only played 3 ranked teams in 1946 and drew with one of them. Army played 5 ranked teams and probably had a better argument, though it barely squeaked by Michigan and tied with Notre Dame. And of course, Army also came very close to losing to Navy on the final game of the season. Now personally, I think Georgia would have beaten either one of those teams, but at this point it's all speculative. Now, in theory, a nothing school can be turned into a big school. In theory, that is. In practice, it really is not likely to happen, not unless certain conferences decide to expand again, that is. Actually, Notre Dame is a really good example of a program that became a blue blood school, but it happened over a century ago. Before the 1920s, Notre Dame's football team really didn't attract much attention, at least not in the national press. Instead, it was the Carlisle Indian Schools team that became famous for playing against teams from all over the country. Now, Carlisle's finest season was probably 1911. This is when it played a schedule that included almost all the traditional powerhouse teams of the time, and most of its games were on the road. Carlisle was seen as an undersized team of outsiders in those days and was seen as no match for the larger and more experienced teams from the East. It was on this play that Jim Thorpe scored a field goal to beat Harvard in perhaps the most famous game in Carlisle history. By 1917, however, the famous Carlisle team was nothing but a memory of the past. Carlisle's football team ended after this loss to Penn at the end of the 1917 season. And it was Notre Dame that took upon itself Carlisle's legacy of challenging the big schools, developing a legend that lasts into this day. So anyway, in other words, it can happen. I mean, it really did happen to Notre Dame. You can get a smaller outside team to become successful and to eventually be recognized as one of the big boys. But it's almost impossible. Remember, it's not the 1920s anymore. And these days, it really is not that realistic. And so when I read tweets like this, I really have to wonder whether the poster really understands what's going on. I mean, one reason that BYU even had a chance in 1984 is because it came into the season with one of the longest winning streaks in the country. After a close loss to Baylor to start the 1983 season, BYU won 11 games in a row. It then won all 13 games in 1984. And it didn't lose until September 8th, 1985, after winning a total of 25 in a row. And despite all of that, despite 25 wins in a row and everything, it still was not able to gain the blue blood or traditional power status. This argument that all you need to do is go out and win really doesn't hold water. And if you think I'm biased for talking about BYU, I could say the exact same thing about the University of Utah, which runs into the same problems despite having two famous undefeated seasons that were more recent. I mean, you've either got your reputation or you don't. Now, there is a problem here with all of these teams, and you already know what it is. This problem is the strength of schedule. Well, back in 1984, BYU fans reacted angrily to NBC's Brian Gumbel, who said on the Today Show that BYU had only played small teams like Bo Diddley Tech. This was a minor controversy in Utah, though it didn't draw much attention at all in the rest of the country. And actually, Gumbel was right. BYU's opponents in 1984 weren't exactly the best schools in the country. And BYU was obligated by contract to play in the Holiday Bowl, which could only attract Michigan, a team with a surprisingly bad 6-5 record. And the strength of schedule problem, more than anything else, is just frustrating to no end. You cannot change your schedule as the season goes on. In fact, you can't even set your schedule like a year in advance. The non-conference schedules are set up years in the past, and then you're stuck with them. And you're also stuck with whatever your in-conference games happen to be. So you hope that at least your in-conference opponents are going to have good seasons so you look a little better. Now, to be fair, things are a lot more fair these years with the college football playoff. Though there will always be a debate about which teams should get into the playoff, at least there's a path to potential victory for teams outside the traditional blue bloods. And as much as I sympathize with arguments like this, the truth is that you've got to win your games to develop a reputation. I mean, if Notre Dame's famous 1924 team had lost, the team never would have gained its current reputation. So I don't know, like maybe there's some hope at all for these schools. I don't know, you tell me. But we really need to stop wishing for a college football world where reputation doesn't mean anything. It's always been a game about reputation. And you know, as long as teams play limited schedules, as long as everything's limited to the fall, there's really never going to be a good scientific or mathematical way to make the rankings fair.